The judge, his prejudice a tangible chill in the air, had already thrown his lot in with the celebrity plaintiff, scoffed at Jasmine Crockett's legal background, and slammed her with a $2,500 penalty, all before the trial clock had even struck 10 minutes. But he was oblivious to the fact that she had come prepared with a covert recording, bedrock Supreme Court precedent, and a legal strategy so incisive it was about to turn his courtroom inside out. What was the revelation that would compel the judge to retreat and leave Whoopi Goldberg utterly speechless? Don't go anywhere. This story is worth every moment of your attention.
The alarm wasn't a gentle chime. It was a siren tearing through the quiet dawn of the Washington, D.C. morning, with the fury of a battle cry. Jasmine Crockett, 39, shot up in bed, her thoughts already a vortex of legal doctrine and courtroom tactics before her feet met the cold floorboards. This day was not about a standard press conference or another contentious debate on a news network. This was a fight for survival, a struggle for her very reputation, in a chamber that felt deliberately designed to orchestrate her demise. Her phone, resting on the nightstand, buzzed without cease. A flood of 11th-hour messages from anxious colleagues and well-intentioned advisors pleaded with her to capitulate, to accept a settlement, to dodge the unavoidable glare of a public trial. To them, it was about mitigating the damage. To Jasmine, it was tantamount to surrender. But surrender was not in her DNA. Retreat was a concept she had never countenanced. Not when her good name, built painstakingly on a bedrock of integrity and service, was facing an all-out assault. Not when Whoopi Goldberg, a celebrity powerhouse with enormous cultural influence and a staggering $20 million defamation lawsuit, had pointed the finger at her. Her alleged transgression? Simply performing her duty, questioning the dubious use of public funds to prop up what she had described as extremist media platforms. This was more than a trial. It was a carefully orchestrated ambush, and Jasmine could feel it in her very core. She had uttered the words at a press conference just 6 weeks prior. They were measured, professional, and deliberately impersonal. Yet, according to Whoopi's high-priced legal team, these words had inflicted severe harm upon the reputation of The View, sparking a domino effect of withdrawn advertising deals. Jasmine recalled every single word, every inflection. Public funds should not be used to subsidize extremist narratives. No individuals were named, no personal attacks were made. It was a firm, defensible policy argument. Nevertheless, the media machine, a creature that feeds on conflict, contorted her words into a cudgel. Pundits on the left, hungry for a tale of conservative overreach, had eagerly weaponized them. And Whoopi Goldberg, stung by the public blowback, had transformed that narrative into a legal hand grenade aimed squarely at Jasmine's career. Now, Jasmine found herself accused not just of defamation, but of an attempt to stifle a revered voice of progress. The irony was almost unbearable. It was offensive, insulting, and transparently political. She wasn't being prosecuted for her statement. She was being targeted for who she was, a conservative woman of color who had the audacity to question the dominant narrative, who refused to kneel before the self-appointed gatekeepers of acceptable thought. Her jaw set as she skillfully styled her hair into a polished professional bun, a familiar battle prep ritual. She had weathered the brutal demands of law school, the chaotic skirmishes of the courtroom, and the unyielding pressures of political life. But this was different. This felt deeply personal. The massive courtroom door groaned open, possessing the weight of a curtain rising on a grim, unforgiving play. And there, in the center of it all, was Judge Edward Grayson, dressed in the customary black robes of his office, but emanating a bias so potent it felt like a physical heat. His eyes, keen, narrowed, and frigid, fixated on Jasmine Crockett the moment she crossed the threshold. It was the stare of a hawk that has its prey in its sights, a predator that had resolved to strike long before the hunt began. Grayson wasn't just known for his years on the bench. He was notorious for his poorly concealed contempt for conservative voices. His judicial record was a long, documented history of activism that leaned so far left it was almost horizontal, making a mockery of the very idea of impartiality. This was the individual who held her fate in his hands, and his expression made it agonizingly clear that justice was the last thing on his mind. As the bailiff's voice echoed, "All rise," Grayson didn't even acknowledge the tradition. He simply tilted his head, his gaze sweeping over the crowded room with a sense of ownership, before settling once more on Jasmine, his eyes filled with the arrogance of a man who believes the story has already been written. His voice, when he finally spoke, was like a blade. "We are here for Goldberg versus Crockett." He then fiddled with his gavel, not as an instrument of order, but as a weapon he was itching to use. When Jasmine started her opening statement, her voice calm and professional, Grayson cut her off in under 10 seconds. The gavel crashed down with a deafening crack. "Miss Crockett, this is not a political rally," he sneered, his voice saturated with condescension. Jasmine, outwardly composed but with her heart hammering, tried to introduce her most vital piece of evidence, an official transcript from the White House briefing that could have instantly dismantled the entire defamation claim. But as she held the document, Grayson waved it away with a peevish gesture. "Irrelevant," he declared, not even bothering to look at the paper. "This court is not interested in your press conference speeches." A murmur of disbelief spread through the gallery. But Grayson was not done. He leaned in, his voice rising. "You will not squander this court's time with political theatrics," he warned, his glare hardening. "Try that again, and you will be held in contempt." And then, in an astounding abuse of judicial power, he did just that. Jasmine had not raised her voice. She had not violated a single rule of decorum. She had simply tried to present her defense. But Grayson brought the gavel down again, this time with a thunderous boom. "You are fined. You... $2,500, he yelled, his face twisted in fury. "Effective immediately for misconduct." A collective gasp swept through the audience. Jasmine was stunned, not by the fine itself, but because she now understood with absolute clarity what this trial was. It was not a quest for truth, it was a raw display of power. She was being punished not for her actions in the courtroom, but for having the nerve to speak at all. Daniel Hirsch, Whoopi Goldberg's lead counsel, moved with the swagger of a man who had his victory celebration planned before the trial even started. Every confident stride he took toward the bench was a drumbeat of inevitability. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and persuasive. "The harm to my client's reputation is not theoretical. It is tangible, it is immediate, and it is deeply personal." He opened his binder and produced thick stacks of printed-out social media posts, a curated gallery of online animosity directed at Whoopi Goldberg. "We have here an overwhelming public reaction," he announced, waving the papers for the court to see. The very moment Miss Crockett made her incendiary remarks, the floodgates of hatred were thrown open. Then came the financial data. Polished graphs with steep red lines illustrated a dramatic collapse in sponsorships and a shocking 20% drop in viewership over just 3 weeks. "This is reputational devastation, Your Honor," Hirsch proclaimed, caused directly by Miss Crockett's reckless abuse of her platform. He turned slightly, a calculated maneuver for the courtroom artists. It was a political attack dressed up in legal jargon, and the judge was loving every second of it. Judge Grayson, who had just shown open contempt for Jasmine, was now leaning forward, completely absorbed, nodding as if he were being enlightened. When it was her turn, Jasmine stood with a controlled grace. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "if I might be permitted to present the official White House transcript?" "We are not here to dissect press conferences," Grayson interrupted sharply. "I will not have my courtroom turned into a cable news set." Jasmine held her ground. "Your Honor, the transcript proves my statement was about general policy, not any specific individual." "And Miss Crockett," Grayson snapped, his voice rising, "I will not say it again. This court will not entertain these theatrical ploys." The gavel slammed down once more. Still, Jasmine did not sit. "The plaintiff must establish actual malice to meet the standard of defamation for a public figure, Your Honor," she stated, her voice like steel. "The precedent is clear." "I know the precedent," Grayson bellowed, his face flushing crimson. "You do not need to stand there and lecture me on the law. This isn't law school, Miss Crockett." The humiliation was intentional, a calculated effort to knock her off balance. The message was unmistakable: sit down and stay quiet. And yet she remained standing, because in a courtroom so transparently rigged against her, the simple act of standing was a profound act of defiance. With a deliberate slowness, she stepped forward. "Your Honor?" she began, her voice quiet but filled with a controlled fury. "Since this court declines to acknowledge the certified documents I have submitted, I will now proceed to defend myself under the rights afforded to me by the Constitution." The room gasped. Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed, but Jasmine was unflinching. "I am invoking Faretta versus California," she continued, her voice ringing with authority. "In that landmark Supreme Court decision, it was affirmed that a defendant has a constitutional right to represent themselves. That right, Your Honor, extends to civil cases where a person's name and livelihood are on the line." She didn't wait for him to respond. She owned the floor. "This entire case boils down to one question. Did my statement constitute defamation?" she said. "Let us be precise. New York Times versus Sullivan established the gold standard. The plaintiff must prove actual malice, that the statement was known to be false or was made with a reckless disregard for the truth." She raised her voice slightly. "There is zero evidence that I made my statement with any malicious intent toward Miss Goldberg or her program." Even the reporters were now sitting up, realizing they were witnessing a constitutional showdown. "Furthermore," she declared, "in Hustler magazine versus Falwell, the Supreme Court upheld that even outrageous or offensive speech about public figures is protected by the First Amendment, unless it includes false statements of fact made with that same standard of actual malice. My statement was an opinion, a legal, constitutionally protected opinion." Grayson's jaw was clenched. The tide was turning, and she was the one turning it. "The prosecution has presented anonymous social media posts and a dubious correlation in ad revenue," she said, dismantling their case. "That is their entire foundation. But public outrage is not evidence of my intent. It is an emotional reaction, not a legal basis for a $20 million lawsuit." A deep hush fell over the room. Judge Grayson reached for his gavel, but his hand hesitated. He didn't swing. Jasmine's fingers hovered over a small digital recorder on the podium. The courtroom held its breath. "This court has questioned my professionalism and my motives," she said, her voice steady. "Now I ask the court to examine its own." She pressed play. Static crackled, and then a voice, Judge Grayson's voice, filled the room, dripping with contempt. "Are you here with a lawyer's confidence?" his recorded voice sneered. "Or are you just a little girl playing make-believe in my courtroom?" The words landed with a thud. Gasps erupted. A juror dropped her pen. The court clerk froze, her hands hovering over the keyboard. The insult was raw and deliberate. It was pure, unadulterated contempt. Jasmine clicked the recorder off and met his gaze, her eyes burning with righteous fury. "That," she said, her voice low, "is the voice of the man who has fined me, silenced me, and mocked my right to a defense. Not based on law, but on who I am." Her hands did not shake. She stood like a pillar of strength. "Your Honor, you have accused me of disrespect. But the disrespect began when you judged me not on the merits of my case, but on my age and my gender." Grayson's face went white. He opened his mouth to object, but Jasmine continued, now addressing the jury directly. "The plaintiff was treated with deference. I was met with interruptions, fines, and ridicule. Justice is supposed to be blind." Her voice rose in impact. "And the truth is, I have done nothing wrong. I offered a legal opinion fully protected by the Constitution, but this court has tried to shame me for exercising that right." Even Whoopi Goldberg looked stunned, her confidence shaken by Jasmine's unyielding resolve. "This is no longer a courtroom," Jasmine said, her voice ringing with conviction. "It's a battleground, and I came here unarmed. Yet I am still standing." The jury was captivated, witnessing not a defendant, but a reckoning. Jasmine turned back to Grayson, who was visibly trembling. "I formally move that you recuse yourself from these proceedings," she stated, citing Title 28 of the U.S. Code, Section 455, which demands a judge step down in any case where their impartiality could reasonably be questioned. Your voice, in your own words, has made your bias not just questionable, but undeniable. A final, devastating pause. Immediately, the courtroom exploded in whispers. Grayson looked down at the bench, the seat of his power now a pillory of public shame. He had already lost. His legitimacy was gone. Judge Grayson's profound, echoing silence was the final blow. He looked utterly exposed. After a long, agonizing minute, he exhaled in defeat. "This court will recess for 1 hour," he mumbled, his voice stripped of all arrogance. I will confer with judicial oversight. He stepped down from the bench, passing Jasmine without making eye contact, his retreating footsteps a march of disgrace. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was transformed. "All rise," the bailiff called, but it was not for Judge Grayson. A new figure entered, Judge Margaret Ellis, a woman known throughout the legal community for one thing: fairness. Her reputation was built on decades of unimpeachable integrity and a zero-tolerance policy for courtroom theatrics. Her very presence reset the moral compass of the room. "Be seated," she said, her voice calm and controlled. For the first time, Jasmine felt the ground beneath her become solid. Justice, long buried under ego, was finally surfacing. The war was not over, but now she had a fighting chance. "Your Honor," Jasmine began, her voice commanding the new silence. "I present Exhibit A, the official transcript of my White House press briefing." She held up the notarized document. "It has been certified by 3 independent parties. I will now read my opening line from that day. Today I want to speak about how we allocate taxpayer funding to media institutions that may, wittingly or unwittingly, perpetuate political extremism." That is it. No names, no shows. And nowhere in the remaining 38 minutes of that briefing is Miss Goldberg's name ever mentioned. She placed the transcript on the table. The plaintiff is suing over a phantom insult. She moved to her next file. "Now I present Exhibit B, Nielsen audience metrics for The View over a 6-month period." She mounted several large graphs on an easel. The plunging red lines told an objective story. "You will see here," Jasmine pointed, "a full 3 months before my briefing, the ratings for The View began a steady decline. Major advertisers started pulling back. Viewer engagement dropped by double digits. All of this happened long before my statement. They are using me as a scapegoat for their own sinking ship." The jurors stared at the charts, their expressions shifting. Jasmine produced a sealed envelope. "Additionally, I have sworn affidavits from 2 senior media buyers, confirming their withdrawal of ad spend had nothing to do with my press conference. Their decisions were based on shifting demographics and falling ROI, not my comments." She handed the envelope to the bailiff. "The evidence is clear," she stated. "The numbers do not lie, but the plaintiff's narrative does." She then turned to the core of their case. Exhibit C, a collection of over 300 social media posts from anonymous users. None were written by me, none were prompted by me, and none of them prove malice or legal wrongdoing on my part. She opened a binder of case law. New York Times versus Sullivan, 1964, established the actual malice standard for a reason: to prevent powerful public figures from silencing criticism simply because it stings. Tweets are not evidence, they are feelings. And feelings are not a legal basis for a $20 million lawsuit. The courtroom was silent. Even Whoopi Goldberg looked as though she'd been hit by a freight train of facts. This case was never about truth, Jasmine concluded. It was about narrative and punishment. But the Constitution does not protect people from being offended. It protects all of us from being silenced. That is the law. And that is the truth. Judge Ellis looked at the mountain of evidence before her and nodded slowly. It wasn't approval, but acknowledgement. The room was shifting, not because of sympathy, but because of the brutal, undeniable force of the truth. Judge Ellis scanned her notes one last time. "This court," she began, her voice deliberate, "has reviewed all evidence. The plaintiff alleges defamation. However, the standard for a public figure is actual malice, an intentional falsehood or a reckless disregard for the truth." She paused. "The defense has submitted a certified transcript which reveals no mention of the plaintiff. Furthermore, the court acknowledges the Nielsen data, which shows a pattern of declining viewership predating the defendant's remarks. Social media commentary does not constitute admissible evidence of malicious intent." The room was perfectly still. Judge Ellis delivered the final decisive blow. "This court finds that the plaintiff has failed to meet the burden of proof. There is no demonstrable falsehood. There is no evidence of malice. Accordingly, this case is dismissed with prejudice. Proceedings are concluded." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Daniel Hirsch slumped in his seat. Whoopi Goldberg sat frozen, her confidence finally shattered. She had faced a woman she assumed would be easily intimidated and had lost. Not to theatrics, but to facts and unshakable poise. Jasmine exhaled, a profound flood of vindication washing over her. As she walked out, several jurors nodded at her with newfound respect. Her victory was not just a legal one. It had exposed the rot in the system and forced a reckoning. The courtroom battle was over, but Jasmine's true mission was just beginning. 3 days later, she walked into the West Wing, a binder under her arm. Facing a table of senior advisors, she laid it down with a soft thud. "We have a problem," she said, her voice calm. The title on the first page read, "Proposal for the Federal Judicial Accountability and Oversight Commission." She explained, "The judiciary is the only branch without an independent check on its power. This isn't checks and balances, it's royalty." She proposed a commission of legal scholars, retired judges, and civil rights attorneys with the power to investigate bias and recommend the removal of judges. "We have ethics boards for doctors and internal affairs for police," she argued. Yet a federal judge can humiliate a woman in open court, and the system protects him until someone is forced to secretly record him. There was pushback. "You'll destroy judicial independence," an advisor scoffed. Jasmine leaned forward. Judicial independence is not the same as judicial impunity. Her plan also included mandatory annual bias training for all federal judges, with real consequences. "This isn't corporate fluff," she said. "It's built with input from psychologists and communities who have lived the consequences of bias. Judges are human, and all humans need recalibration." By the time she finished, the room was silent, but everyone was listening. Her victory had sparked a movement. Months later, the ripple effects were undeniable. California adopted a judicial oversight commission based on her proposal, implementing a real-time audit system for rulings. In Texas, a state known for resisting such reforms, the governor announced the Crockett Protocol, a task force with teeth to review courtroom performance and sentencing disparities. The movement spread to Georgia, Illinois, and Arizona. But the most radical shift was happening in the judges themselves. A federal judge in Michigan voluntarily recused himself after an audit flagged gendered language in his transcripts. In Colorado, the state judiciary issued a public apology for a wrongful sentence. And in every statement, the same phrase echoed, following the precedent set in Crockett versus Goldberg. Even Judge Grayson, humbled and disgraced, found a path to redemption. At a mandatory judicial training seminar, part of the very reforms Jasmine had initiated, he stood before his peers. "I didn't defend the law," he confessed, his voice heavy with regret. "I defended my ego. I let my own fear and bias dress up as experience. What Jasmine Crockett did in my courtroom wasn't just courageous, it was necessary. If she hadn't forced me to see myself as I truly was, I never would have looked." He then stepped down from the podium and took a seat among the attendees, no longer a judge but a student. One by one, other judges joined him, a quiet acknowledgement that the system they represented had to change. Jasmine's legacy was cemented, not just in headlines, but in the hearts of those she inspired. Letters poured in from domestic violence shelters, retired judges, and even the wrongly incarcerated. "You were fighting for all of us who never got our 5 minutes of voice," one wrote. Yale University renamed a lecture hall in her honor, Crockett Hall, dedicated to the pursuit of fearless advocacy. But the most stunning acknowledgement came from her adversary. On a special episode of The View, Whoopi Goldberg looked into the camera. "Look, I don't like her politics," she said, "but I respect the hell out of that woman's mind and her grit. She walked into that courtroom all by herself, and she systematically dismantled a lawsuit I thought was ironclad. Jasmine Crockett is the real deal." The clip went viral, changing the national conversation. Respect doesn't require agreement. It requires honesty. Jasmine Crockett's story reminded the nation that the courtroom doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to the prepared. She faced a system designed to crush her and forced it to look in the mirror. She proved that if you stand up with evidence in one hand and courage in the other, you cannot be ignored. And if the system doesn't open the door for you, you push it open anyway. You walk in, you speak your truth, and you remind the world that justice doesn't need to be invited. It needs to be demanded.